This is actually what a Dyson swarm probably looks like. This is where it's all coming down to. This is like the final countdown of whatever stage of the singularity we're in.
If Dyson swarms are the endgame infra, the mid-game is collapsing under our feet. What happens to SaaS when base models keep getting unhobbled?
Elephant in the room here is this is just an unhobbling of capabilities that were already present in the model. There may be some fine-tuning or post-training that's involved at the back end, but this is essentially, I think, what one might call an unhobbling of latent capabilities. And I think it does raise the question every time a few of these other SaaS stocks have a mini SaaS apocalypse freakout from some unhobbling of a base model, whether and how much of the remaining economy is one unhobbling of a scaffold away from utterly cratering existing verticals. I really do think that, and I say this to every company I advise, you really don't want to be just a SaaS at this point. You don't want to be just a scaffold around models. You need your own vertically integrated native capabilities. If there's a physical world integration that you can credibly claim or build out, you really should be doing at this point, because software is getting dissolved. And in the case of Claude design, I've been using Claude to design PowerPoints and websites and other, call them prototypically Adobe-esque outputs and artifacts for months now, if not low numbers of years, across all of the frontier models. We already had these capabilities. It's just that through unhobblings like Claude Design or Cowork or even Claude Code originally, Anthropic is very successfully giving users permission to do what they could already do with first-class Chrome. And I think it does raise the question, how many other user experiences that right now are their own dedicated verticals are one unhobbling away from just latent capabilities? And I think near the top of my list is creating new businesses. I think creating new businesses is just an unhobbling at this point.
Dave,
software is getting dissolved and no one is safe. So what is the level above business plans that AI is now generating end to end?
Sure. Yes, entire businesses, not just business plans. I think maybe we need to do a little bit of brainstorming for Anthropic here on the pod. I propose the name, we need a plan for a country of non-geniuses outside the data center.
Entire businesses, not just plans, wild. The labor market side of this is just as wild. What is happening to junior software engineers right now?
Maybe the 1/3 who thought the entry-level SWEs are going to be replaced are the senior SWEs and executives at the company who are better positioned to judge that. I would just comment, we talk, I think it's fair to say, about being in the singularity. It's not just vibes, and recursive self-improvement is not just vibes. This is exactly what one would expect to see if we are, as I would argue we are, in the midst of recursive self-improvement, where almost all of the code, it's been widely reported at Anthropic, is now generated by Claude. At other companies too, at Apple, at Google, this was, I don't think we have a slide for it on this pod, but pretty spicy news in the past 24 to 48 hours, rumors out of Google DeepMind that a lot of Google DeepMind code is now being generated by Claude. So I think it's not just necessarily junior SWEs that are being replaced by hypothetical future releases of Claude. It's also other frontier models from other vendors that are being displaced. The blast radius is pretty wide for this.
Claude generating DeepMind's own code, the blast radius is huge. So what is the new ladder for young engineers supposed to look like?
The SWE ladder gets yanked up, but then we see in other news in the past 24 hours, Meta announcing an upskilling program to teach people over a relatively short period of time how to lay optical fiber in data centers. Nice. So I think these are all just patches or bridges to an ultimate solution. Can debate what the ultimate Star Trek economics look like after this is all over. But in the meantime, certainly if you're a software engineer, a junior one, maybe you want to start your own company or shift to some other career ladder that has more of a ladder to it.
Meta retraining juniors to lay fiber in data centers. We are here. Now, switching gears, Elon is bragging about XAI's parameter count. Is that the right race?
Alex, what's your take on this?
Maybe to chime in, I think this doesn't necessarily bode well for XAI's roadmap if they're bragging about parameter counts. I don't think this race to superintelligence, as with Moore's law ending when Dennard scaling ended in the mid-2000s and the gigahertz per processor, per CPU processor core topped out at 4 or 5 gigahertz, I think it's unlikely that we're just going to see larger and larger parameter counts on models. I think most of these weights, I've commented on this in the past, most of these weights are probably wasted on world knowledge that could be safely externalized into a database or a text file. It's doubly so if once we're able to fully resolve the attention bottleneck and our ability to expand context windows to infinity, or at least to a few billion characters or tokens, I'm not sure that we need all of this knowledge built in directly into the models. So I worry a little bit that this may signify that XAI or SpaceX-AI may be running the last race and not the current race, which is focused on distillation and iterated amplification and finding, if anything, what I would have hoped from Elon's late night tweet would be a race to reduce the number of parameters at constant capability. I think a race to the bottom where we're compressing more and more capability into a smaller and smaller parameter count, so-called intelligence density. I'd love to see him bragging that XAI is going to be doubling, tripling, 10xing its intelligence density per model. And that's what we see from some of certain neo labs that are bragging about their move. You know, Dave and I like to talk about ternary quantization or even just pure binarization of models. I think there's probably some sort of breakthrough, or maybe a set of breakthroughs right around the corner that will enable us to take the capabilities of a raw, say, undistilled 10 trillion model and compress them down to maybe a few million parameter equivalents. That's what I'd like to see Elon focusing on.
So yeah, totally right.
Parameter count is yesterday's race. Intelligence density is the real one. So what would even be a convincing Elon metric here?
Don't you think?
It does. And he's the king, the god emperor, if you will, of brute forcing. So I think even if he had just said, here's the training kilowatt hours or gigawatt hours that we're going to spend on these respective models, and we saw that we're spending more and more on training, I think that would be probably a more convincing experience law curve to highlight than just the raw parameter count, which again seems like he's pointing to a trend from 2 years ago that the rest of the industry has abandoned as ineffective.
Pointing to a trend everyone else abandoned, God Emperor of brute forcing, and are AGI definitions just becoming whatever a lab needs them to be?
I think we're going to see a lot of that, and the snide part of me wants to look at the tweet or X post that you posted through computer science language. Is it possible that he's actually defining AGI as Grok 5.0 and defining ASI as 6.0? Like, if you look at those right arrows in pseudocode, that's how I read it.
Well, also, right, we're going to define AGI when Amazon invests in Anthropic.
That's right. Or OpenAI's definition, AGI is whatever it takes to produce 100 billion in revenue from it. So I think these definitions, Salim, are somewhat malleable. But I also, to Peter, taking your question seriously about whether capabilities get so advanced that ultimately the frontier labs no longer want to share them, that's already starting to happen. We saw that with Mythos, which is already being used like with a delimited set of users. It's not being shared with substantially all of Europe, other than the UK, which is no longer formally part of Europe politically. And I think we're going to see potentially, I chat with my friends at the frontier labs all the time. They're expecting all of this to happen in the next couple of years.
Mythos already delimited, AGI redefined in real time. And meanwhile, a wave of OpenAI executives just walked out. What do you read into that?
Well, go ahead, Alex. I'll think for a minute.
Lots of thoughts. So OpenAI has seen multiple waves of executives leave over the years. I'm reminded of the great Anthropic schism where Dario and Jared and others all left at approximately the same time and formed Anthropic. I would not at all be surprised based on what I'm hearing if this is another one of those events. The Anthropic schism happened in part due to OpenAI, an earlier version of OpenAI, focusing its attention away from broader research, away from robotics, away from broader RL initiatives, instead focusing just on large language models. And I think this is another moment where OpenAI has just completed its historically large fundraising round, like $120+ billion fundraising round.
Ever.
They're targeting an IPO as soon as the end of this year. And they're in a death match with Anthropic to achieve recursively self-improving AI researchers and code generation the fastest with Codex versus Claude Code. And I think anything from that vantage point, anything that isn't in that innermost loop of recursive self-improvement, and that means AI for science, that means video generation. It may mean elements of vertically integrating higher elements of the stack like B2B applications. Anything that doesn't get them into that innermost recursive self-improvement loop, I think is getting thrown out the window. I would not be surprised if we discover in the next 2 to 3 months another Anthropic-like frontier lab emerges from this schism, and we go from 3 or 4 or 5, depending on how you count frontier labs. There's a new star in the heavens. A new frontier lab is born with a curiously large amount of capital funding from inception that has a totally new approach for solving AGI/ASI. That would be my guess.
A new frontier lab born from the schism, bold prediction. On to the other big drop. OpenAI just shipped GPT Image 2. Did it pass your test?
Alex, do you have a standard test you use with image models?
It's been an evolving test over time. For OpenAI's image models, I'll often ask it a molecular diagram question. This time around, my first prompt to it was, show me the molecular diagram for, a typical drug, say ibuprofen or acetaminophen.
Or my favorite drug, caffeine, 1,3,7-trimethylxanthine.
Caffeine's a little bit easier in some ways. Maybe it's more popular. So it got a couple of the details wrong. It added a couple of alkane linkages in ibuprofen that weren't there. I tried a few other tasks. I asked it to create manga for a single chapter of Accelerando. Did a decent job. I asked it a few other tasks. I will say the text qualities are vastly improved. If you look at the benchmarks, so arena.ai benchmarked this as 1,512. That's, I believe, an ELO score. That's the largest gap. It's number 1 scoring text-to-image model now in their text-to-image arena, far ahead of number 2, which is Nano Banana 2. So this feels like a remarkable jump. A few other comments, if I may. One is the way OpenAI rolled this out, which is to comment on the reasoning abilities. We talked almost a year ago, I think, maybe 6 to 9 months ago on the pod about how eventually we're going to see images as first-class reasoning modalities, that the frontier models will start to think to themselves as humans do with sort of a gestalt image rather than in language. And I think we are starting to see the dawn of first-class visual reasoning by the models. I think that's very exciting. I think use of tools by ChatGPT Images 2.0 or GPT Image-2, depending on which way you're calling this. I think tool use for image generation is an interesting plot twist. Query whether that will lead to additional copyright infringement claims. I don't know, but interesting question. But I think the biggest question we should be asking here, doubly so in the context of a story that we covered elsewhere in this pod, which is the departure of a number of key OpenAI executives, ostensibly in service of OpenAI trying to better compete with Anthropic in the code gen races. Why is OpenAI releasing such a compute-intensive model? When Google launched Gemini's Nano Banana Pro and Nano Banana Pro 2, the rumors going around were that it sucked up an enormous amount of Google's compute and that Google was scrambling to find the compute to service the Nano Banana Pro demand. So why now, in the middle of a code gen and AI researcher race, is OpenAI choosing to release what ostensibly would be pretty compute-intensive modality that probably, if I'm speculating here, but if you look at the enterprise value of text-to-image generation, I would speculate it is an order of magnitude or more less valuable than code generation. So why in the middle of this hot race is OpenAI releasing an AI model? So this is
any ideas? Any
I'll
theories?
speculate. This is unvarnished speculation because it's a pretty strange bit of timing to drop Sora on the one hand and then launch a next-gen image model on the other. One thought, this is again admittedly speculation, is if images are much lower compute cost at this point to generate. If the speed at which it's able to generate images has somehow, through algorithmic advances, suddenly gotten a lot cheaper and faster, maybe images are no longer that compute intensive, and maybe OpenAI has achieved some sort of algorithmic advance versus, say, Google's Nano Banana Pro, in which case they can actually afford to allocate whatever the compute necessary is to this without breaking a sweat or otherwise interfering with their recursive self-improvement program. That's one theory. I could speculate as to other theories. Another theory would be somehow if image generation is actually instrumental in competing with Anthropic. Anthropic, as we've discussed on the pod previously, doesn't allow users to generate images. So perhaps, again, speculatively, maybe OpenAI thinks that reasoning over images, and I would note even in that launch video, OpenAI talks about and in their demonstrations, generating screenshots, for example. And in fact, Sam was teasing this release earlier today by posting what looked like a screenshot, I think, of Mac OS, and saying that, in effect, this isn't a real screenshot. So maybe OpenAI is betting on some form of supremacy in code generation using images as some sort of intermediate representation. Maybe they think that having stronger image gen capabilities will lead to better, say, UI design code gen or something like that. Those are the first two speculations that popped into my mind.
Fascinating. When we heard that they were going to be dropping something, of course, we've been waiting for Spud to drop, right? Their answer to Mythos.
Right.
Still expected
coming
this month, possibly?
Still expected, based on everything I'm hearing, still expected imminently. It may be branded as a sort of a 0.5 model, ChatGPT 5.5, if you will. But as far as I can tell, it's still expected imminently.
Images as a first-class reasoning modality, you called it 9 months ago. But does this launch even fit OpenAI's stated enterprise pivot?
I scratch my head again, just briefly over that, because every narrative that I've seen out of OpenAI, certainly in the lead up to IPO, including out of their CFO, is that it's the same narrative of OpenAI transitioning over from consumer use to enterprise use. So again, such a head scratcher in my mind. Are enterprises just loving text to image? Maybe, or is
No. Are enterprises really loving text to image? Hard to believe. Now, for the story only April 2026 could produce, SpaceX reportedly grabbing cursor. What is going on?
Alex?
There are a few. I think this is a bizarre story, but it's the sort of bizarre story that could only happen in April of 2026. So a few thoughts. One, pigeon, I would say, like dovetailing with the last story, we're seeing that code generation and the rise of AI researchers is maybe in some sense the innermost loop within the innermost loop. Everything seems to be coming down to the question of who can generate the at least among the frontier labs, who can generate the best code, and why generate the best code, so that you can build the best AI researcher to generate the best AI to generate the best code. That's what all of this seems to be coming down to. So a few thoughts. One, Elon and others have made comments after the SpaceX XAI merger that XAI was not built correctly from the start, and that they needed to start all over again. SpaceX's VP of Starlink, who's also now head of engineering for XAI, made these comments similarly publicly as well. There was a desire to reboot. Query whether this acquisition, or quote unquote right to acquire Cursor, actually ultimately represents a complete reset of Grok, whether this is in some sense a manifestation of or an admission that Grok's code gen abilities were not remaining competitive with the frontier. What's the frontier? It's Claude. Next point. So there have been many studies, many analyses of Cursor's behavior, and of course Cursor was for the longest time able, before it decided to launch its own first-party model, was in a somewhat privileged position to watch user interactions with all of the existing third-party frontier models. And so if you're Cursor, you have to ask yourself, you're in some sense in a position of quasi-vulnerability to those frontier model vendors. What do?
Quasi-vulnerability.
Quasi-vulnerability. Yeah.
Very big quasi there, yeah.
Yeah, the quasi is a load-bearing word fragment there. So you're in a position of vulnerability. What do you do? Well, to the extent that you have access to user behavior, you take as much user behavior and context as you possibly can. You probably take a Chinese open weight model and you fine tune the heck out of it based on all of this user behavior. And to the extent that you can replicate Claude code or Claude-level code gen abilities, you probably try to do that. So if you're SpaceX AI and you really would like to be competitive with Anthropic in particular, what's the best way to do that? Well, you buy yourself optionality from Cursor, which may be question mark, one of the best and or cheapest ways to basically acquire Anthropic level user interaction for cogen, given all of the users that have been interacting with Claude via Cursor. That's a second thought.
Fascinating.
Third thought, if I may, is the whole cloud angle. So SpaceX, right before our eyes, is turning into a hyperscaler. We talk about the Dyson swarm all the time, but this is actually what a Dyson swarm probably looks like. It looks like a cloud in the stars. And it's seemingly going to be the first major tenant of the Dyson swarm that SpaceX AI is going to build in sun-synchronous orbit, or maybe around the sun. I don't know, but either way, this is potentially, even in SpaceX's announcement, 1 million H100 equivalent. That's Colossus now. That's ground-based, but that's just an anchor third-party tenant. Historically, Colossus and Colossus 2, Elon style, were fully vertically integrated with only Elon's applications. Now we're seeing an opening up of that cloud infra layer to third parties. Cursor may or may not get acquired. I would expect to see many more deals like this, where Elon is now exposing his vast GPU set on ground and soon in orbit to third parties. So how soon until we're all running our compute loads on Colossus, Colossus 2, or whatever SpaceX renames or name, maybe it's Colossus 3 in orbit. I think it's a very interesting time for orbital clouds, and we're starting to see the beginning of that.
SpaceX is the first orbital hyperscaler. Breathtaking. If Codegen is the final countdown, why is every lab dropping everything else?
I also just want to contextualize, if I may. We talked about this elsewhere in the pod. Rumors flying again that Google DeepMind researchers, many of them aren't using Gemini for CodeGen, they're using Claude. So I think in some sense, there's a sense in the air that CodeGen, for recursive self-improvement AI researchers, this is where it's all coming down to. This is like the final countdown of whatever stage of the singularity we're in, where SpaceX is scrambling with $60 billion acquisitions and OpenAI is dropping large chunks of their initiatives just to focus on this, and Anthropic is hoarding the compute that they do have just to focus on this. I think I see, if you sort of squint at the chessboard, all of the major players are dropping either large amounts of capital or dropping entire other initiatives just to focus on CodeGen. And I think, I would speculate, but this is somewhat informed speculation, that's because CodeGen, in all of their minds, this is like the critical path to maximum change, maximum acceleration, and something interesting is certainly going to come out.
To Grok 5.
Maximum
Grok
recursive
6.
self-improvement. Well, yeah, Grok 5, which is conveniently the definition in Elon's mind of AGI.
Grok 5, Claude Code, Codex, all converging on the same innermost loop. And the infra underneath, where does this land as a share of the economy?
Well, the Dyson swarm is going to consume a huge portion of our economy. I don't know that this should be that surprising to the audience. If it's 1% one year and 10% the next year and 50% the following year, at some point, all of this infra spend, all of this tiling the earth and soon the heavens with compute, surely this consumes the economy. This becomes the de facto economy. I would argue that this is fundamentally unlike the railroad build-out, which some maybe bellyache saying, well, actually, if you look at the railroad build-out, that consumed a disproportionate amount of the GDP, and ultimately there was a collapse. Or you compare it with Apollo or interstate highways. I really do think it may not happen in this economic cycle. It may happen 2 or 3 economic cycles later, that data centers are the infrastructure for the future of civilization. I really do think, say, 10, 20, 30 years from now, the majority of intelligence in our solar system is likely to be intelligence that's hosted on data centers and not human, maybe a good deal sooner than that. That's very, very conservative outer bound. So if this is the entire machinery of civilization, then at what price do we price this spend? It's the future of our whole civilization.
Data centers becoming the machinery of civilization. That is the scale. If the economy grows tenfold, does the public-private split even matter?
This is, for me, the most exciting part.
If the economy grows as quickly as some expect, including Elon and including myself, I'm not even sure the distinction between public spend versus private spend matters that much. If the economy ends up growing 10x, who cares whether it's the approximately 1/3 of the economy that is the public sector or the 2/3 that's the private sector? If the pie grows so wildly, it almost, in my mind, doesn't matter. The government could, if in a much, much wealthier future, a few years from now, the government could pick up the tab for AI data centers if we want, and that would still be enormous compared to the size of the economy that we have right now. So in my mind, to the extent I sound a little bit blasé, perhaps, about the distinction between private sector funding this build-out versus the public sector, it really is because I think this is the fundamental infra for the future of civilization that will get us to 10x year over year.
In a 10x economy, the public versus private distinction dissolves. So what is your ceiling on the share of GDP flowing into AI data centers?
I'm curious to take a spot poll, if I may. So we're all obviously very excited about 1% and a continued increase in annual percentage of GDP for AI data centers. I'm curious, of the three of you, what do you think, looking backwards historically, will end up being the actual peak annual percentage of GDP spent on AI data centers?
On Earth and in space?
Everywhere.
And on the moon, in the human sphere of existence.
And after we've disassembled Jupiter.
It will approach 100%.
Yeah, it should just keep going.
Okay, so you think it goes to 100%. What about you, Salim?
Well, I think over time it should get higher and higher because over time, as you talk about your inner loop, everything becomes computonium and everything should be in service of building that.
What about you, Dave?
If you include, building physical things to make people happy as part of the data center build out, it's 100%. If you take that out, I'd say probably 95%.
I think it's going to, this is not investment advice. I think it's going to cap out somewhere between a maximum a quarter or a third of GDP and then decline after that, because at some point AI data centers are consuming so much of our available capital and resources that pressure increases through the roof to reduce that spend through new means of automation like robots, and maybe we get our nano assemblers, and that creates cost efficiencies that maybe compensate for to the extent there is a bit of a Jevons paradox here. I don't actually think it's going to go to 100%. I think it'll peak somewhere.
You're cheating on definitions here.
And also,
Why
at some point, we're going to be under a post-capital and post-scarce world, in which case GDP becomes meaningless.
You think GDP is going to become meaningless before we finish exhausting data centers?
GDP is out of date now. This is a whole other debate.
GDP itself may be meaningless before data centers cap out. Heavy. Now, thinking physically, where do supply chains actually want to live long term?
I think manufacturing wants to be sovereign at the end of the day. I think we're going to have advanced nanotechnology and all sorts of other sci-fi-esque technologies that enable every sovereign nation state to be able to effectively re-domesticate or domesticate their entire supply chain. I don't think it's necessarily, given all of the technologies that I think I reasonably foresee over the next, call it 5 to 10 years, I don't think supply chains necessarily want to be global in the long term. In which case, capacity, domestic for the US or otherwise, is limited more by technological advances and capability than any sort of geopolitical shifts or shifting around of supply chains. I just, with all of the advances that I expect to happen over the next 5 to 10 years, I just don't see a bright future for global supply chains and, in particular, globally supplied manufacturing at all. Not investment advice.
Alex, if you think about
supply chains wanting to redomesticate, beautiful framing. And politically, how many Dyson swarms should we expect to see?
globalized, but not politically. I think we end up with probably two sovereign Dyson. Well, the US is going to wind up probably with, I think, 3 or 4 competing corporate Dyson swarms, and who knows how many China will wind up with. Query whether Europe or other parts of the world will be capable of launching their own Dyson swarms in time. But that's still a political division of the heavens.
Yep. Salim, you're going to say?
3 or 4 US corporate swarms plus China's. That is the geopolitics. But why do Chinese firms keep trading at such a discount to Western ones?
It's also, I think, in part reflective of, admittedly, a cliche that the way public companies work in China is materially different, usually from the values of very shareholder activist West and the US. The cliche, of course, is that for Chinese public companies, profit is not necessarily as prized a measure of performance as it is in US and Western companies. And if you do like a discounted cash flow analysis for Chinese public companies, and then you also discount the impact of the CCP and government regulation, maybe there's in some sense a suppression of book value that comes from that otherwise could be realized if they were a little bit more profit oriented and a little bit less, say, oppressed by the CCP. But I think it's an interesting statistic for sure. And one would certainly, if you're a US policymaker anywhere other than San Mateo County or San Francisco or Santa Clara, you would absolutely love for your geography to be the world center of the future. But I would pose maybe as an open question, how do we get diffusion from Silicon Valley and SF to the rest of the country and the rest of the world?
Well,
I have lots of thoughts.
The billionaire tax will do that.
Billionaire tax is the diffusion engine. Snarky and fair. Switching to space now, what is your take on NASA's new cadence under Isaac Mann?
Well, I think it's notable that United Launch Alliance, ULA, isn't even part of this conversation. It's just the neo-space companies, SpaceX and Blue Origin. I think competition is profoundly good. I don't think we want to wind up in a singleton where a single company controls the Dyson swarm, which I think is still more or less the end game here. I think a lunar station on the South Pole with Artemis 4 is just a waypoint to launching lots of AI data centers from the moon, and I think SpaceX, based on their recent public communications, would agree with that. So I view this as a very positive thing. And I would like to see, ideally, more than 2 Western companies that are capable of rapid reuse of boosters. Hopefully, we'll see at least 1 or 2 more publicly traded companies or soon to be publicly traded companies in the space do it. We're certainly going to see quite a bit from China. I think this is very positive. I, for one, just on Artemis 4 specifically, I'm looking forward to Artemis 3, which is, I think, a very, according to Administrator Isaac Mann's new roadmap for Artemis 3, it was originally going to be Artemis 3. That was the crewed landing on the moon, pushed it off to Artemis 4 so that Artemis 3 could focus on a demonstration of the docking of the lander and the orbital vehicle. And I think that's going to be super interesting. I love the new cadence that NASA has announced under Jared Isaacman of rapid iteration, in some sense, SpaceX-like rapid iteration toward colonizing or, let's say, disassembling the solar system. This is the only way we get there, and this is an important step in that direction.
SpaceX like rapid iteration at NASA, finally. But long term, where does the actual profit sit in the space stack?
For sure. And I think it's sort of an interesting microeconomic question to ask. How many different transport to LEO services, or let's say heavy launch providers, do we actually need in order to keep that market competitive? And is that a long-term source of profit? Or is that sort of, as with, frankly, civilian air transport, a case where profit margins are driven to zero? It's just a transport. It's just a dumb pass-through. Right. And all of the profit is in LEO with data centers or orbital Hiltons or something like that.
Transport becoming the dumb pipe, profit up the stack. Now, a full pivot. What is actually happening with UAP disclosure inside the government?
You know how Elon likes to say the strangest words to the effect of the strangest future or the most ironic future ends up being the one that we find ourselves in? I find myself, when hearing stories like this, wondering whether a UAP could land on the White House lawn, be fully televised, and then general public turns up its nose and asks what's next on television because of issues relating to over-politicization. If the president does the proverbial Rose Garden address and makes some major announcement in connection with UAP disclosure, NHI, will people just, or at least maybe half the population, say, I don't believe it for 1 second because of the overly politicized climate of the moment and what else is on? I do wonder whether we're going to find ourselves in that world. I will say, like I was, a few weeks ago, I was on Capitol Hill doing closed-door briefing with Senate and House staff on issues relating to science and technology. And I will say on Capitol Hill, this issue is taken extremely seriously. It's contra, say, 10 years ago when it was well outside the Overton window of discourse. It's very much inside the Overton window of discourse now. I chat with friends of mine who are in charge of the relevant hyperscalers and the government clouds who are actually in the process of carrying out the president's historic UAP directive to declassify files on top secret government networks that are connected with disclosure, his now historic executive order regarding UAP disclosure. And as far as I can tell, this is all in process. And I'm hearing stories from my friends at the hyperscalers about how UAP disclosure in connection with the president's executive order is scheduled to conclude no later than January of 2027.
Declassification scheduled to conclude by January the 2027, historic. If the age of disclosure allegations are real, what are we actually looking at?
Yeah, I will say, and I made similar comments when last we were discussing the documentary Age of Disclosure, that if the central allegations in that documentary are accurate, and just to provide sort of a one-sentence summary, the central allegation made by 35-plus senior current and former U.S. government officials in both the executive and the legislative branches, the central allegation is that there has been a highly illegal 80-plus year campaign project to capture, retrieve, and reverse engineer crashed UAPs. That's the central allegation of that documentary. If that central allegation turns out to be accurate, then I would argue, and I have argued in the past, that this is borderline crime against humanity. If literally, as alleged in that documentary, if there are civilizations, non-human intelligences, essentially raining technology down on us, and there's some illegal group, illegally operated quasi-governmental, quasi-contractor-based group that is recovering artifacts that could advance human technology and civilization by centuries or millennia, and it's just being suppressed or even worse, weaponized for purely offensive or defensive military purposes without seeing the light of day of civilian applications, which could affect a variety of sectors. I think that type of conspiracy, if it is indeed real, is not just criminal, but I think it's a crime against humanity that, if accurate, I have to add the appropriate caveats, would have potentially set back human progress by maybe a century. I think it would be devastating. So that's one of several reasons why I think this is a very interesting space to watch. In my mind, we're getting superintelligence from AI one way or another. I think in some sense, there's relatively little alpha left in extrapolating the superintelligence explosion. But when I think of what are the sort of crazy left turns that could hit civilization in the next few years, it's a very short list of crazy things that could happen that would derail the singularity or alter the course of the singularity. I think something like this is one of them. This is near the top of the list. And so I think it bears close scrutiny.
A crime against humanity if reverse engineering happened in secret. Heavy. If ASI gives us galactic superpowers, why would any NHI stay quiet much longer?
It's certainly concerning. There have, even in the past 24 to 48 hours, been statements from both the executive and the Congress talking about the active investigation. There have been messaging from congressional leaders that this is now being treated as connected, as opposed to just an unfortunate coincidence.
We see that tweet down below by Representative Ogles that says, "I have seen evidence so classified that just knowing it exists makes you a target."
It is very concerning. I want to make maybe one closing comment, if I may, on the intersection, call it between artificial superintelligence, ASI, and the statutory term for this is non-human intelligence, NHI, ASI, NHI. And that is this. We talk, I talk on this pod often about building the Dyson swarm, disassembling the moon, disassembling planets. I'd like to think a little bit larger scale for just a minute. I think as a civilization, we're on the verge of having enough technology, thanks to AI, to be able to send von Neumann probes, self-replicating probes in all directions at relativistic speeds throughout our galaxy, and all other things being equal, if we wanted to, as a civilization, converting our entire galaxy over the course of tens of thousands of years, light speed limitations, obviously, to paperclips. If we wanted to paperclip the entire Milky Way galaxy, and we're alone, we could in a few years with advances in AI and space and AI in space. And so if there were a time for any non-human intelligence elsewhere in our Milky Way galaxy to make a cameo appearance and stop us from at least having the optionality of paperclipping the rest of our galaxy, I think they're going to have to make a cameo appearance sometime in the next few years, because this intelligence explosion is about to give us, as a civilization, galactic superpowers.
Inash needs to make a cameo now or never. Brilliant framing. On the other side of your week, something you actually built just happened. Tell us.
Yeah, this is sort of an interesting split screen. So let's rewind to last year when China ran their first humanoid robot half marathon. I watched that story. I covered it, and I was so upset that the US and the West had nothing like that I resolved to try to start a US equivalent. And my first pitch was with Tom Grilk, who's the former head of the Boston Athletic Association, which ran the Boston Marathon, including at the time of the Boston bombing, to the Boston Athletic Association, trying to persuade them that they should host a humanoid robot or robotic marathon the weekend of the Boston Marathon. And they looked at me like I had dropped a dead fish on their table. So Tom and Tom recruited his son, David, and I recruited capital from my fund, O21T Capital, and we funded a startup in this area called Professional Robotics League that this past Sunday, we're recording this on a Tuesday, on Sunday, we held the country's and North America's and the West's first humanoid and non-humanoid professional robotics race ever. We did this in the Boston Seaport. You can see some video here from the event. We had a range of manufacturers, Chinese and Western robotics manufacturers. It was a 50-meter dash because we had to start somewhere. And it was a tremendous success. I'm just sad that we couldn't do a live podcast from this event because there were so many Moonshots fans who showed up. There were people flying in from Texas, people flying in from Canada just to attend this event. This was historic first for the country. Yes, the robots were operating a little bit more slowly. Yes, we didn't have the support of the Chinese Communist Party forcing everyone or every robotic vendor to participate. But we had to start somewhere, and I think it was a wild, wild success. The most touching moment for me, we did an exhibition match the day before on Saturday, and there were people just walking by on the street in the Boston Seaport. Little boy came up to the railing that we had set up, a little barrier, and said at one point to me, "I think I could do a better job designing a better robot. I want to be an engineer when I grow up." And I was ready to burst out in tears. That was the most touching, I think, event from the entire race. I would just say we're going to need to do quite a bit more like what ProRL is doing in the West in order to make sure that US retains primacy in robotics, but we're going to do it.
A kid at the railing wanting to be an engineer, that is the best KPI. Totally different beat. Apple just named a new CEO. What changes now?
We'll look back on the Cook era as being analogous to the Ballmer era of Microsoft, that we had Bill Gates as the original visionary technocrat founder CEO. Then the antitrust trial pushed Bill in a number of ways to be chief software architect, focus on his foundation. Ballmer stepped in. Ballmer, more of an operator, less of a technological visionary for a number of years. And then we got to the Satya era now, where we see Microsoft being resurgent again with new categories, willing to drop initiatives that weren't working, refocus initiatives where Microsoft could once more become a technical leader in the cloud and elsewhere. My best guess is we view the Jobs to Tim Cook to John Ternus transition as somewhat analogous, where John came up not through operations like Tim Cook did, but he came up through hardware engineering. And so I would expect a new Apple under John Ternus starting later this year to be more focused on breakthrough hardware devices and hardware-centered innovation. Of course, the elephant in this particular room is AI and Apple's seeming inability, after multiple swings at bat, to position itself as the lead distribution platform or server for AI. It has fallen prey to all the frontier models, and even Microsoft, with its quasi-failing Copilot initiative, has leaned more into AI than Apple has. So I would expect a new device-oriented AI strategy from John Ternus. Maybe, ideally, I was chatting with a new friend from Apple marketing a couple weeks ago in San Francisco, asking them, why on earth, given the popularity of OpenClaw, why isn't Apple leaning into an OpenClaw-oriented device strategy? You're selling Mac Minis like they're going out of style. Why isn't Apple marketing all of its hardware as being personal OpenClaw? Silence.
You want to hear something amazing?
Ternus as the Satya-style hardware turn, Apple marketing Mac Minis as personal OpenClaw. Back to Iran, what is the near-term outlook for Helium?
Yeah, I've seen scattered reports of shortages of certain memory chip facilities in South Korea facing reportedly multi-week deadlines to resolve their helium shortages before they're unable to manufacture memory chips. I'm not sure where this ends. It's almost easier to predict what happens after it ends, which is to say, I think it's high time to start helium startups. I think having this global geopolitical dependency on one narrow, volatile geographic region is completely unacceptable. A lot of helium certainly comes as a byproduct from fission. There have been various speculations over the years. I know you and I, Peter, have talked about unconventional isotopes like helium-3 being mineable from the moon and elsewhere. I look at material shortages and I say in the long term, each of these is a startup opportunity for us to come up with clever new ways to radically decrease the cost of generation and also redomesticate production. I think there's been, from what I've read, meaningful movement in the direction of strategic helium reserves. I think that's probably an important component of this strategy. Truth be told, I don't know where the Iran war and helium in particular shortages end, but I feel more confident in predicting what happens after it's over and how we make sure that we're never technologically in this position again.
Helium startups and strategic reserves, the abundance reflex. Last one. Is AI about to make everyone an entrepreneur, whether they want to or not?
Or if I may, Peter, or your AIs. I think even brainstorming problems is not a limiting factor. AI is quite good at identifying problems. This is one of the reasons I have to just name check company I have a financial interest in, Henry Intelligent Machines. Him, from friend of the pod, Alex Finn, is premised on the thesis that not only is the cost of starting a business going towards zero, but everyone can and will be, who wants to be, an entrepreneur, in the same sense that anyone who has opinions or taste as a consumer can become an entrepreneur thanks to AI, where AI operators are carrying out all of the difficult or non-obvious tasks, and you as aspirationally as a one-person investor, magnate, conglomerate owner can oversee a fleet of AI operators being entrepreneurs so that you can just be a gentleman or gentlewoman investor or magnate. I do think we are going to find ourselves in that future.
Yeah.